Welcome, folks. Left Reckoning. I'm Matt Leck. Flying solo this week, just as David Griscom was last week. We're staggering our spring break so we can bring you the Left Reckoning uninterrupted. But I will have a guest later. Got a great interview with Carl Beijer, carlbeijer.substack.com, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Carl's very knowledgeable guys. Good to be able to talk to him about this for a good length of time. And in the post-game, we'll have Gene Bajla on OGTNBS, if you remember, talking about multipolarity, and if this is looking like a good multipolarity, or if maybe it's premature to say something like that. I think it appears that might be a little bit premature. But first, I want to take you to Matt Leck's History Corner before I go to that interview with Carl. Imagine a world where there's rising populist sentiment against a corrupt two-party system. And the populism is accomplishing, or at least coming to similar demands, to the point where political parties have to say, yes, we support that as well. We'll put that on our political platform. 1912, the GOP continues a strategy that kept populism at bay in the 1890s, adopting a progressive platform with no intention of keeping it. Say, we support the PRO Act, we support $15 minimum wage. No, wasn't those ones. It was more shorter work days, 8-hour work days, and importantly, a state grain elevator. We're talking about North Dakota history, folks. One story had an establishment Republican figure, a rhino maybe we could call him at the time, arguing with a constituent farmer late into the night, saying, "Go home and slop the hogs and leave the lawmaking to us." Enter a guy named Arthur C. Townley, who's been on my mind for a number of reasons recently. He was a failed farmer. He briefly had a successful flax farm, and a combination of weather and price manipulators in the big cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul. He failed and turned to socialist organizing. His experience was that socialism wasn't super, and there's obvious sort of material reasons for this, when part of your core identity is you own this giant bit of property, or renting it or mortgaging it, but you want to be the ownership of that. So he wasn't finding calls to collectivize farms and the full socialist prescription that wasn't working super well. But he did find that talking to farmers about specific legislation was a winner. So Townley quit the socialists and started what would become the Non-Partisan League. And the idea for this, as Norman Risjord writes in Dakota, it was a revolutionary idea because it recognized the weakness of third parties in the United States and the dangers of fusion with one of the major political parties. Townley instead would capitalize on the newly invented primary to gain control of one of the established political parties. And since North Dakota was essentially a one-party state, his natural target was the Republicans. His method was to enlist members, regardless of their previous political affiliation, in an organization with specific farm-oriented goals: state ownership of the terminal elevator and flour mills, so like the grain elevators, state inspection of grain quality, state hail insurance, and taxes based on acreage rather than farm improvements, and nonprofit rural credit banks. None of the planks in the platform was new, and that was its appeal. They had been discussed for 2 decades and received the approval of most farmers. Townley and a few of his friends began visiting farm homesteads that spring and to enlist members. The membership fee was $2.50 a year, later raised to $6, and with his first receipts, Townley, who had crisscrossed the countryside by horse and buggy, bought a Model T Ford to improve his mobility. With subsequent receipts, he began hiring recruiters, most of whom were socialists experienced in personal contact organizing. One veteran recalled a typical send-off. Find out the damn fool's hobby and then talk it. If he likes religion, talk Jesus Christ. If he is against the government, damn the Democrats. If he is afraid of whiskey, preach prohibition. If he wants to talk hogs, talk hogs. Talk anything he'll listen to, but talk until you get his goddamn John Hancock to a check for $6. With a fleet of nonpartisan league-owned Model Ts, Townley's organizers were able to blanket the state by early summer. Recognizing the need for centralized leadership, Townley ceased his own canvassing and established a nonpartisan league headquarters in Fargo. In September 1915, he founded a newspaper, the Nonpartisan Leader, and with that, the shadow of a movement became a political force that could not be ignored. Sprightly written, the Leader gave North Dakota farmers a blend of muckraking expose and homely wisdom. Cartoonist John M. Beijer kept the state chuckling over his depictions of the old gang, i.e. the Republican establishment, as overweight, bowler-hatted, diamond-ringed capitalists. The Nonpartisan League grew to 25,000 members and crushed establishment Republicans in the 1916 primaries. Its governor candidate, Lynn Frazier, winning in a landslide, and elections winning 81 of 113 House seats. Establishment Republicans held a small advantage in the Senate because of staggered terms. There's always a legislative session of extraordinary accomplishments. The only thing that the stalwarts in the Senate were able to block was a House-packed revision of the state constitution that specifically allowed the state to own and operate agriculture and manufacturing businesses. Among the laws approved that spring were a state wheat grading system, a 9-hour workday for women, so, improved on that, reduced taxes on farm machinery and improvements, a prohibition on railroads from charging more for a short haul than a long haul, and tripling of the state aid to education. State-owned grain elevators, the centerpiece of the Nonpartisan League's platform, went down to defeat of the revised Constitution. And you also have, at this point, a rising anti-communist sentiment that, of course, intensifies after 1917. But North Dakota businesses starts to red bait the Nonpartisan League. And as we talked about with the discussion on the St. Louis Commune, red baiting goes back a long ass time. It wasn't just, of course, McCarthyism was before that. Of course, it was even before Wilson in this period. Although Wilson particularly anti-communist, which you wonder why Glenn Beck doesn't really talk about that. But back to the narrative here. North Dakotan business starts to red bait the Nonpartisan League and starts the Independent Voter Association, originally called the Anti-Socialist Conference. Yet the Nonpartisan League won again and took control of both houses. Using its spring 1919 session, the legislature created a state-owned Bank of North Dakota, which I owe for the loan that allowed me to study abroad in London. It was much better terms than I would have got anywhere else. And I know a lot of other people who used that loans from that bank for the same purpose I did. So this is when they create the state-owned Bank of North Dakota to make low-cost loans to farmers and finance state business enterprises. To ensure that the bank had ample capital, the law required county governments to deposit their funds in the bank, which is baller. Uses state power there. The legislature also authorized a statewide system for state-owned grain elevators and flour mills, and it enacted such progressive measures as a workers' compensation law, an 8-hour day and minimum wage for women, and a constitutional amendment authorizing the recall of state officials accused of malfeasance through a popular petition and special recall elections. So I would have de-emphasized that stuff, to be honest. I think, corruption politics, we've talked about that with the whole Lula shit. But anyway, the anti-communist tide meant that was the last real hurrah. And that's a little bit simplistic. Nonpartisan League had effects. It persists to my parents' day, at least. I mean, vestigially. But the big hurrah of progressive reform was really wiped out by this period after World War I and this Soviet Revolution. Townley was convicted himself by a Minnesota court of disrupting the war effort during World War I and sentenced to a year in prison, serving 90 days of it. And then, like I said, I don't know if I mentioned it, but he became a red baiter himself in his older days, getting into libel lawsuits with the North Dakota Farmers Bureau. So I hope you enjoyed. I should say he's been on my mind because of the whole war stuff going on, and like, you know, people thrown in jail for that. And it wasn't just Debs. It was this guy who was frankly at odds with socialists. The socialists were criticizing the Nonpartisan League of the time for, I think, reasons that you could see their limitations with the farmer-focused approach, but also got big results. And that staying grain elevator still at this day. And I think, like, I just want to underline the sort of limitations. This is how you work within the system in a way that, you know, like I don't like when I'm painted as just anti third party, but I think you got to be real about this stuff. And I think this was an interesting case of people being real about it and taking over the Republican Party in a way that, I don't know. I think it's pretty impressive. And that grain elevator stands. So anyway, patreon.com/leftreckoning, and I'm going to get you over to the discussion with Carl. And like I said, Gene live in the post game. See you, folks. Welcome, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. Not with me is David Griscom, but with me instead is one of my favorite bloggers who's been at this for longer than he was just telling me that I was exposed to him in the Bernie campaign, but he's been an OG at this, and you can tell he's the proprietor of the Carl Beijer Substack. That is CarlBeijer.substack.com. Go subscribe to that like I do. He's also in Jacobin and People's Policy Project. Carl, thanks so much for joining me today.
Glad to be here. Glad to talk to you.
I wanted to talk to you because we have a segment Left Reckoning here called the Bum Steer, where we take people to task for basically misleading an audience on a large scale. And I kind of feel a little bit guilty of that. I wasn't maybe as dismissive as some of the possibility that Russia would take aggressive action against Ukraine, but I certainly wasn't expecting what we've seen. You did not make that mistake. And you actually have a blog that you called Even if Russia were to invade Ukraine, the U.S. should not go to war. The case against war does not depend on whether Russia invades. Now, talk us through your headspace leading up to this, and also sort of like how bad folks like myself should feel if we were a little bit too cavalier about the possibilities for this. And actually, that's a good basis to start. So on those questions.
Well, so one thing I think to bear in mind is nobody was expecting this invasion from Kiev. Or into Kiev, like from the top, like what actually happened. This is nuts. I know people on the ground in Ukraine, people with contacts in the government. It doesn't make sense. And this has been a big critique of what Putin is doing. It's just absolute madness. There's no sense to it. So you did see, you know, some military in the north sort of massing there. Or doing exercises, which they do sometimes. And so that made it a little bit ambiguous. But this is like the scale of this invasion and the way it has played out, moving towards the north and just going everywhere. Very, very few people expected this. Even the people, you know, I am sure even people in the military who were watching them mass on the borders like this, I don't think even they expected something of this scale. This is really, this is crazy. The reason that I did not rule it out, there are a couple. For one thing, they've invaded Ukraine before, very recently. We know that they do this. It's really more of a practical question for Russia than some sort of ethical question about whether it's okay to invade borders. The other thing was, so a lot of the dismissals of Russia invading, a lot of them seem to doubt that they even had troops on the border. And I knew that was wrong because Russia has had troops on the border ever since they invaded the first time around. I have been to Kharkiv, and I have, heard the gunshot. I mean, they have not just invaded, there has been active conflict going on, just very, very small scale. So I've heard gunshots. I've seen the evidence of Russians being in the area. It I think that it was always just a matter of time until something like this happened. Um, so yeah, I was avoiding coming out and making any definite statements about what would happen. I just didn't think that people were coming at being skeptical of it for the right reasons and coming at it from a real place of knowledge about Russia's past activities in the region.
Yeah, and this kind of brings me to the point where, like, this moment as a referendum on the credibility of the left or anti-imperialism, like that's where I get a little bit concerned because, like you say, I think a lot of people miss this. I was listening to Dave Rubin's show, and he had an American Enterprise Institute, or Jordan Peterson's show, I should say, and he had American Enterprise Institute guy on. He's like, first things first, I have to say I was wrong about this. I did not think they'd do it, right? So, like, it seems like the forecasting errors can be a little bit forgiven. And then we have this move about, like, as a referendum on anti-imperialism's credibility in general.
Well, I mean, okay, so one thing I will say, like, even the people who got this right, I mean, come on, we did not have like a bunch of random scholars with donut emojis in their handles. Like, we didn't have all of these people sort of studying satellite imagery of how many tanks were on the border and things like that. People were guessing either way based on who they thought was credible and who they didn't. But very, very few people had any real knowledge. And I include myself in that. I include just about like anyone you'll see on Twitter and the media. The only people who really, really knew what was going on were either Russian or possibly people working in US intelligence. But there was no real way for us to know what was happening. I don't think this is a referendum on the anti-imperial left. I think that, there's that old joke about if you want to know what's going on, look at what the State Department says and then assume the opposite. I think sometimes maybe people take that a little too seriously, but it's a good joke because it's generally true in that a lot of times it does make a perfect sense to meet anything that our intelligence community or the DoD or state or any of these people, it's good to meet that with skepticism. I think that the where people go astray is they start assuming, well, the opposite must be true. And that might be where we ran into trouble here,
right?
I think.
Now, for folks who might be coming across the term tanky for the first time, what should they know about that term?
So it has a historical meaning, having to do with Khrushchev rolling in tanks back in the day. So here we're referring to a very, very specific narrow military action. And back then, the sort of Soviets and communist sympathizers and people like that defended this. They were putting down a revolution, defended this, saying, no, this is a bourgeois revolution, and this is the Soviet Union sort of defending the workers, et cetera, et cetera. And so over the years since then, the term tanky kind of became synonymous with people who defend militant action for the sake of communism or against imperialism, against the empire, etc. That's the etymology, but I really do not think it has much to do with how this term is used today. Because today, in my experience, the places I run into tanky, and I hear this a lot. Number one, you hear it from like people with kind of dubious connections to intelligence and stuff like Bellingcat people. or like some guys who've worked in foreign state departments and stuff, and who always seem to find a left way to take the State Department line on everything. There are a few strange actors like that wandering around in the discourse, and these are the people who love to call you a tanky if you ever have any kind of criticism of basically anything the US government does. You always you see that with kind of, liberal democratic loyalists too. And they will also use it, not just with reference to foreign policy, but with reference to domestic policy. So, throughout both Sanders campaigns, people called me tanky all the time. And it was merely for, supporting sort of a mild social democrat in the United States, saying stuff like we should have single payer healthcare.
Yeah.
So I think there's this conflict these days where within the left, some people still do use it in that very old archaic way. And sometimes it makes sense that way. But the overwhelming use of tanky, the popular use of it today, it's just synonymous with calling people commie or pinko or anything like that. It's a slur. It's a slur, and it's not just used against like Marxist Leninists or anything like that. It's used basically against anybody who is critical of capitalism or the Democratic Party. And so that's why I always have a really instinctive, reflexive aversion to tanky. I guess one last reason I'm skeptical of that term is a lot of times, even when it's used against people who should be criticized, they often aren't taking what you would sort of technically call a tanky line, a kind of line that tankies would get behind. So you're going to sort of talk about this in a minute, but like Russia, some people are being called tankies because they're defending the Russian invasion here. Well, that wouldn't really be a tanky position, because Russia is not invading on behalf of Soviet communism or anything remotely to do with, a real challenge to the bourgeois class. It's just another internecine bourgeois fight.
Yeah.
So I'm skeptical of the use of tankies in this sort of Ukraine-Russian discourse too, for that reason.
Yeah, it seems to me like in the same genre of the Red-Brown Alliance, like it's sort of liberals that are very anxious about communism want to have some sort of historical label to throw onto something, but like it's often labeling people who I wouldn't really consider the modern equivalent of Reds as Reds, and it. Yeah, I think generally those two things, I agree with you that like the way they're deployed seems pretty much bad.
Yeah. And it's funny, it's odd, because there's sort of I've used tanky to sort of poke fun at people before. I feel like, for one thing, that's a very different thing when it's coming from people who actually are sympathetic to something resembling Marxist Leninism or the Socialist Communist Project or whatever. I think it's different coming from people like me. And honestly, like when you hear me say it, I only ever say that critically when I'm making fun of people who do have this reflexive response to opposing any position that the US takes, instead of taking a orthodox, socialist or communist position.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about so Russia. There, and I will say, like, probably what fed into my dismissal was the how over the Russiagate stuff I was. Like, just as a topic, I've been super interested in it. but Russia, like, do we need to reassess Russia as a state? I'm curious, like, there's debates about if Russia is doing imperialism and if that affects our stance on what's going on there in with their invasion. How do you feel about that question? And also, like, on top of this, like, I'm also speaking of things that even if I criticize someone like Tulsi Gabbard or Tucker Carlson, the way they're being criticized is problematic, I think. So touch on that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, what sort of incentives might be at play versus like just labeling people, a Putin agent?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think first, just to sort of clarify what I would say would be the socialist position on this is a war where Ukraine is caught between two large bourgeois factions. On one side, I would put the EU and the US, who have been working to sort of integrate them into their faction. On the other side, I would place the Russian oligarchy, who have been working to sort of reincorporate Ukraine into their sphere of influence and sort of economic power. I do not think that talking about this as imperialism is very clarifying or helpful, because I think that this is a inter-imperial struggle, essentially. I think people who try to talk about this as imperialism are trying to make some kind of weird strategic argument that, yeah, Russia is sort of a bourgeois capitalist state, but the US is even worse, and we're going to try to play them off each other. And like, I think they're making that kind of argument. I do not think that's really an orthodox use of imperialism versus anti-imperialism. So I'm not using that language to talk about it. As for, talking about Russia as, a state that is doing propaganda, of course they are. Everybody, Ukraine is doing it too.
Yeah.
You can see it all over Twitter, certainly. And all of these states have always done propaganda. I don't think that was ever really on the table with the Russiagate controversy. I don't think there was ever any question. For me, at least, the real question was always, okay, yeah, so we know that all of these different states do their thing. Is there, number one, any reason to believe that they actually influence the outcome? Number two, is there any reason to focus on Russia in particular, as opposed to all of the other countries? And for me, the answer for both of them was really no. I certainly did not see any significant evidence that Russia changed the election. It's very hard to sort of tease out whatever effects it may or may not have had from the static of polling fluctuations and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And in terms of whether it made sense to focus on them in particular, I think what may or may not have gone on with Russia and Trump was maybe a little more blunt than usual, but it's not like systematically different from what Israel does all the time, or what any number of states are doing all the time, trying to, and like Clinton, Hillary Clinton herself, she has always had big investments in Ukraine, and Pinchuk, one of the Ukrainian oligarchs, was one of her biggest supporters at the Clinton Foundation. So there are conflicts of interest there too. Right. When we talk about propaganda in this war, yeah, of course, Russia is doing war propaganda right now, again, as is Ukraine. I guess I don't think that's very interesting or tells us very much. Like, we should, we should read the news skeptically, but we always should. People just need to learn to be able to do that. I don't think it's a good idea to start banning even Russian state news sources or anything like that. I don't think it's I guess I'm different from a lot of people who are up in arms about it, in that I also don't think this is the priority issue right now. Like, it's bad, but I'm much more concerned with other aspects of this war, like preventing the US from, giving more arms to Ukraine and heating this up even more, and so on.
Yeah.
So you ask about people like Tulsi and Tucker and these allegations of being Russian assets. Again, I don't think so. Let me give you an example. Recently, I took Michael Tracy to task because he disputed the recent hospital attack on a maternity hospital in, I think it was Maripol. I'm not quite sure which city it was. And he did it on the grounds that it hadn't been independently verified. Well, so there were two ways to criticize him on this. One was to point out that this just so happened to be the Russian line at the moment. You could look at Russian state actors and they were all saying this. Well, maybe Azov staged this. Who knows what happened? Just trying to sort of cast doubt on whether what they did was actually what they did. And yeah, I think that, like, I don't think Tracy is working for them. I think it's entirely possible that because he doesn't really know what's going on, that he sort of has an eye on them and thinks, yeah, that seems like a good question to ask, and just sort of repeats it without really. But I think, like, that's just sort of him being dumb. I think the real critique here is that these attacks had been independently verified by the UN when he said that. And so what's the point in trying to tie him and discredit him by pointing out, by saying he's a Russian asset, when you can just say, look, this guy keeps getting his facts wrong.
Yeah.
And he clearly doesn't, like, he gets basic things wrong. Like, he'll go over to Poland and take pictures of troops deploying from there and think that he's breaking news, even though this has been in the news forever that NATO has troops over there. So many of the people who get accused of being Russian assets would be much easier discredited if people were just like, hey, you're saying stupid things and counterfactual things. And you wouldn't have to get entangled. As soon as you start making these Russian asset accusations, then suddenly you're put in this really bad position where you have to prove something that's basically unprovable and that nobody is ever in a position to prove. And then they can just ridicule you as a conspiracy theorist and wave you off. And I mean, there's something to that. If you don't have any proof of them being Russian assets, you probably shouldn't be throwing that around. I've had that thrown at me plenty of times. I do think I think that what I would say is, I think that there are probably conflicts of interest out there. I think that there are probably people who just repeat what they see in Russian media because and just take it at face value for various dumb reasons when they absolutely shouldn't. But I just don't think that talking about them as, Russian assets or useful idiots or whatever, I just don't think that mostly just ends up discrediting very valid critiques of what they say.
Yeah, I think your example with Tracy is exactly right. Because like I have plenty of criticism with Michael Tracy as well, but it's just like, show people your workings, and they can draw their, rather than trying to give them some sort of like, it's
like, how many times do people have to see this play out? You catch one of these guys on saying something stupid, and they sort of flail around and don't know what you want to say, and they're just waiting for somebody to call them a Russian asset so they can quote tweet them and say, LOL, I'm a Putin bot, and then get like 300 people dogpiling you. Yeah. This happens every single time. You aren't going to get anywhere doing that. I don't know why anybody does it.
Yeah. We kind of mentioned, what pressure should be on Joe Biden. What's your assessment of Brandon so far and his reaction to this? Because, there's from the from just like Jonathan Majority Report, a lot of it is like, thank goodness he's not staying firm against the no-fly zone. But I think there's probably a lot more to consider than just that question.
Well, so it goes two ways. My understanding is that Biden is under a lot of pressure, not just from people in Congress and outside, but even within the White House, to really, really ramp things up and get NATO much more involved than they already are. And that he is pushing back against it. It's very reminiscent of Trump, right? Trump was often the guy pushing back against a whole lot of hawkish behavior in the White House. I think one difference between Trump and Biden is that Biden's such an old hand at this and has been dealing with these people such a long time that he's fine with just standing his ground and saying no when he can. Whereas, Trump eventually starts feeling insecure and starts feeling like he has to defer to the generals. And so he would give in eventually over and over again. That said, and I will say I have zero confidence in him holding the line on a lot of this stuff, like especially no-fly zone stuff. But that said, the real, he is imposing these sanctions, which are just monstrous. I was talking to some people earlier today. I really think that is going to be the second biggest foreign policy mistake of my lifetime after the Iraq War. This is going to set Russia back 30 years in terms of economic development. We're just going right back to the way things were when communism fell. You're going to see mass poverty. You're going to see it's going to radicalize the populace against the U.S., which is what these kinds of sanctions always do. It's going to further realign Russia away from the US and the EU and towards India and China, which, it's not in our interest, and we would be better off allies than finding ourselves in a oppositional relationship like that. But, the sort of bottom line here is it's also just not going to do anything to get rid of Putin. If anything, it's going to entrench his position further, because now, instead of this big middle class opposition that we have out there protesting and feeling like they can stand up to him, you're just going to have this country of very, very poor people, not much of a middle class, no one feeling like they can stand up to him. Nobody's powerful enough to stand up to him. It's just going to be him. So I think this is completely counterproductive. I think that it is absolutely disproportionate to the, like when we're talking about violence in war, there's always a question of proportion, right? If somebody does something, we can't just go in and nuke Russia because of them invading the Ukraine. We have sort of standards of, okay, they only did this much, so we're really only able to respond this far. Well, people look at sanctions and they kind of think, okay, well, this isn't that big a deal, but this is a huge deal. This is a 30-year wound, like I said, on Russia. So,
Well, I think this is a good moment for you. You had another blog on do-somethingism. Define do-somethingism for folks, and why that's not something we should do.
Yeah. So I first ran into this during the Iraq War when I was doing a lot of anti-war organizing and stuff like that. And when I would talk to people, just the sort of go-to response when I said we should not be in Iraq, we should not be sanctioning, we should not be doing any of this stuff was, okay, well, what do you say we do then? And that line is really persuasive for a lot of people, because there's this default assumption in the US that we always have to do something, and that there is always a positive thing we can do to substantially improve things and fix problems overseas and stuff like that. But this is a case, like in Ukraine in particular, where I cannot see any good in really, any kind of actions we could take against Russia. People, think of the most innocuous thing people were talking about, sanctions against oligarchs. They thought that would be a good idea. Well, like I sort of suspected it would, Washington did not hear support for sanctions against oligarchs as support for that in particular. They just heard it as, okay, yeah, people are on board with sanctions. Let's do it.
Yep.
And that's what was always going to happen with that. Every option that's on the table right now, sanctions, no-fly zone, giving them weapons, putting troops on the ground. People are talking about like assassination missions, just all kinds of stuff. Every single one of them, the most likely outcome is that things get worse than that. And so, if you're somebody who's pressing for action, the burden isn't on critics to come up with something better. The burden is on the people calling for action to actually demonstrate that it would improve things. And especially in cases of war, that burden is really, really heavy, because we're talking about justifying the US going in and killing people, either with bullets or by arming people or with sanctions. Nobody is presenting a case for action that overcomes, these kind of objections. In Ukraine, specifically, what I see going on, we're pouring arms in there. So we're arming this large population of militias that are only kind of semi under government control. People are very focused on Azov and on the Nazi problem over there. But one thing to bear in mind is the civilian control of the military over there is tenuous, even if we don't take into account these Nazi militias. You have a lot of just sort of vaguely paramilitary people, especially now, just going around and doing what they want with really big guns.
Right.
And this is a recipe for even if Ukraine won tomorrow, suddenly you're going to have all of these guys who, some of them really don't like Zelensky, especially the Azov folks, but, even people in the East, for example, you have a lot of people there running around with guns. This is going to completely destabilize Ukraine. And that's it. That, I guess that's one objection. A equally serious objection is there is very, very little chance that we are going to do enough to actually get a decisive win for Ukraine. All this is going to do is prolong it. Mm-hmm. Eventually, they've already started bombing things. Ukraine doesn't have that much of a response to these missile attacks, which is why they're begging for, some kind of, and bombing attacks, which is why they're begging for a no-fly zone. Russia is just going to pummel Kiev to the ground and then start rolling in ground troops. You can't get tanks in there because of all the rubble with this kind of attack once the city has been decimated this much. But they're going to bring in ground troops eventually. You're going to have this terrible, bloody, protracted urban war in Kiev. There's really, and this is just going to go on and on and on until there's some kind of armistice. Mm-hmm. Better that it happens now, because the longer this goes on, the more entrenched everybody is going to get dug into their positions. So I think, if we're going to be involved in any way, we need to basically just be pushing for the best settlement we possibly can. Just be pushing for some kind of peace. That's really the only way that we can contribute to things right now.
Yeah, and that's why Hillary just psychopathic at the start of this, making explicit comparisons to Afghanistan.
It's
You go ahead.
Oh, that's just crazy. Like I shouldn't have interrupted you because I'm sure you were going to say the same thing. Yes, this is very analogous to Afghanistan, because we're going to create a radicalized, impoverished population. It's not even going to solve the problem long term. Russia's still going to be there. It's not like it's going to suddenly lose any interest into going into Ukraine. So I just don't see what we're supposed to be accomplishing there. But in any case, like, the reason I talk about this as do somethingism is people need to think about like these burdens of proof and stuff like that. You have even progressives, Marianne Williamson really saying, we've got to do something. And it's just like, look, if you don't have a specific idea that can make things better, no, we really are better off just standing back.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's like, I mean, for those folks, it's like, well, bug people about accepting refugees and doing what you can for those folks. But like, when it comes to like, well, let's start talking about certain types of military equipment. It's like,
I mean, I guess, so there are things you can do, like accept refugee. I mean, ironically, the things that we can do are the things we aren't doing, like very dramatic refugee programs, and sort of humanitarian aid settlement stuff. Honestly, I think that if we are imposing sanctions on Russians, and deliberately trying to make their lives worse so that they overthrow Putin, I think that we should be offering refugee status to anyone in Russia if we're going to be doing that, and say, okay, look, like, if you don't want to get murdered by an FSB guy or whatever because you've protested Putin, fine, leave the country. We will at least protect you then. We aren't going to force you into this lose-lose situation, because that's what they're doing. But they won't even do that. They won't. It's just, they're just sacrificing millions of Russians who are powerless and impoverished and who have nothing to do with what's going on and can't do anything about it, just purely out of like spite and ideological commitment to sanctions.
Yeah, the credit card thing really should have driven that home for anybody, that like, oh, we got to do something, so let's stop the credit card payment system. And immediately you get the news stories that, oh, this is actually hurting the folks that are trying to escape the
credit card. The SWIFT. I started getting really worried as soon as I saw the SWIFT payments being cut off, because that's something that Russians use to, like, send payments across the border. Like, you have people who migrate from Kazakhstan and who are sending money back to their families. And a lot of the same way you have people from Mexico migrate into the US and do it that way. You have the same kind of things going on, and a lot of them use SWIFT. I'm not sure how much movement they've made over to sort of PayPal-ish type things. That might be changing. But I do know that as of 5 years ago, SWIFT was still really big on that stuff. So yeah, you have SWIFT, you have the credit card stuff. And, and even these little things, like, I was really, it just kind of hurt me to see McDonald's pulling out of there, just because, like, that's something that sort of ordinary Russians love. Like, that's something like you save up for so you can take your kids to on their birthday. Like, it's just a little thing that's in Russia that makes everybody's lives just a little bit better. It's not like the oligarchs are getting screwed over by that. One thing to bear in mind is, unlike in the US, McDonald's in Russia doesn't really use the franchising system that we use. And that means that you don't even have the sort of class of franchise owners who are getting all of the profits and all that. It just goes directly to the company. So this isn't even hurting that level of people. All it did was lay off 60,000 workers who, get a little stipend for a while, but that's not going to last forever. And
Yeah, I thought that was really depressing. That there was that video people were laughing at about the guy saying I've eaten this food all my life. And it's like
yeah,
that sucks bad, and that guy had nothing to
yeah,
do with this.
yep,
Well, we kind of mentioned it already, but let's talk about the nationalist element in Ukraine and the role they play when sort of armed conflict there. I agree with folks who get a little bit upset at maybe the overemphasis of this, particularly Putin's using denazification as a
yeah,
primary reason for the invasion. And I think when you see like missiles hit like hospitals and stuff like that, and the idea that those are all Nazis in there is revolting. But
yeah,
also, like we said, if we're going to flood this place with weapons, there is a massive nationalist, violent right wing element to it. Put that in context for folks.
So at this point, I don't know. I honestly could not tell you how big these hard right elements are, and it also gets weirdly definitional. So for example, everybody over there is saying Slava Ukraina. That's a slogan that they've been using for a very long time. It's kind of like the OK sign in the US. Does everybody who uses OK, does that make them a Nazi? No. Does everybody who uses Slava Ukraini, does that make them a Nazi just because it was popularized by the Azov people? I don't think so. I think that's just, it's just like a God bless America type phrase. I think I don't even like patriotism, so it annoys me on that level.
Mm-hmm.
But so you first have this problem of it's sort of people have different definitions of who counts as a Nazi, and I think some of them are overly broad. I think that the people who are uncontroversially Nazis are the people who, the Azov people, the right sector people, people who are wearing the insignia on their uniforms, all of that. They've done polls. You never know how to rely on the polls over there. And they're like something like 5% of the country will just admit to open anti-Semitism. But this isn't ubiquitous in any sense. I guess the real problem I've always seen is that not only do they have Nazis, but their Nazis are in positions of significant power. So they don't have that taboo, which we sort of do still have in place, where you aren't supposed to put open Nazis in office or appoint them. And so, you have people in like cabinet level positions. I think there are still a few people in the Rada. You have some mayors, and of course in the military, you have entire military brigades that are just Azov, openly Azov, and they are doing their own thing. They're basically out of the government's control. Zelensky is trying to bring them in under formal government control, but I don't think he's succeeding, and I don't think he will. So what I will say is, yes, there absolutely is a serious Nazi problem over there. I think that it's a bit more serious in terms of structure, in terms of who has the power, than it is in the US. I think it's probably comparable to the US in terms of how widespread it is. I wouldn't exaggerate it more than that, but it does matter that these people have power. When I look at the way people talk about it, you have to thread a needle. Like when Putin tries to talk about this as a denazification campaign, that's just absolutely ridiculous. That's not why he is there. That is just, it's just it's a defending our freedoms line from George W. Bush. That's not what he's doing in there. I think that I guess like a lot of times, we wouldn't defend a invasion. Like most people wouldn't say it's okay to start just bombing massive civilian areas in the US because we have some Nazis running around.
Right.
And the really weird thing, the most striking thing to me about this Nazi discourse is that actually a lot of the people who have suddenly become like very aggressive critics of Nazis in Ukraine have been the same people who really get mad if you talk about Nazis in the US. And they demand that you kind of pull their punches, or they say, no, those aren't really Nazis. They just, might have some politically incorrect ideas or something. They are not significantly different than what you'll see in Ukraine at all. I mean, we talk about Russophobia. I think that there may be some kind of weird xenophobia going over there when people are pretending like it matters less if Nazis are in the US than if they are in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just want to mention quick. Yeah. Branko Marcetic made the comparison to Jan 6ers, and like, is that too reductive to say like the Maidan protest was a weird mix of sort of like the European bourgeois liberal, almost resistancy types, and like you'd be sympathetic, and then also a Jan 6 type of element, or is that too American for?
I think that's not. I mean, there's some sort of funny little parallels there, but I think like the January 6th, the right in the US has always done this. Yeah, we're going to overthrow the government and we're coming in armed. Like they've been doing that kind of stuff for years. Mm-hmm. I think this was like the weird occasion where they actually, the cops sort of stepped aside and let them in. They're getting unruly enough, and they actually went in there. And so you always have like a bunch of like crazy oath keepers in the crowd who actually are planning on doing shit. And then you have other people who just sort of got inside and are like, okay, what are we going to do? And like start walking around confused. The Maidan was a very, very different situation because you had people hunkered down for a really long time who were not going to leave, who were absolutely intent on getting rid of this government no matter what. And you did have a significant role in coordination played by, mostly local, like USAID attached NGOs. And I don't know if I would assume that probably some of the Soros NGOs over there, some of the open society-ish ones, because they're everywhere over there. And they're always sort of have their nose in all these different little populist uprisings. So I don't think that's really comparable, but you did have a very significant white nationalist element providing security there. Mm-hmm. During and stirring things up. They were being really aggressive. They were like keeping police at bay. I was a little disturbed because I noticed the other day that Terrell Starr, the journalist over there, one moment he talks about how he's hanging out with these, quote, patriotic Ukrainians out in the middle of nowhere. And then the next, he's sort of talking about their background and saying, yeah, so, before this, their only background was providing security at Maidan. Like, there is a very good chance that these are right sector people at this point. Right. So, I guess like in general, I think it's fair to, when you see Ukraine promoting, Stepan Bandera, when you see soldiers with, that sun symbol on, when you see Nazi paraphernalia, I think it's fine to call it out. I've done it myself too. It starts getting stupid when you start pretending that Putin is doing epic Nazi denazification, or that these insane attacks on civilians are somehow justified in the name of taking these people down. Because, like evidently there is a terrible attack just a couple hours ago on a theater I think that was also in the South, which had hundreds of civilians inside. And I have no doubt that Russia is going to say, yeah, there are like 3 Nazis in there or something. That's just not ethically justified under any kind of moral framework I can think of. It's just grotesque. And I'm really, really horrified to see people sort of bending over backwards to try to justify that or talk about how it's sort of funny. And, this war is just an absolute tragedy. The Ukrainians on the ground do not deserve what's happening to them. This is going to destroy the lives of perfectly innocent, good people. A lot of them very like left politics, socialist politics. When I lived over there, I worked with some socialists and sort of tried to help them get organized and things like that. These are the people who were now throwing under the bus and saying, we don't really care if you get bombed. And it's kind of a similar logic to the sanctions, right? Because we're saying, well, if you really cared about the Nazi problem, you would have stopped them by now. No, you can't. Like your random teacher working in Lviv isn't going to be able to do anything about a bunch of guys with weapons over in Lviv or, whatever. It's just absolutely grotesque to hold the broader civilian population responsible for what these Nazi brigades and all of these other groups are doing, or to say that it's okay to destroy them. It's the exact same kind of reasoning as with sanctions.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it. I don't want to get frivolous again with Dave Rubin. So on that note, Carl Beijer, follow his Substack, carlbeijer.substack.com, and look for him in Jacobin. And anything else you want to plug, Carl?
No, I guess that's it. That's usually where I'm at. So,
all right. Thanks a bunch.
Yep. Glad to.